2018 had a lot of great music. There was also a fair share of pretty bad music. That's my intro. Here are my bottom 10 albums of 2018. As with my top 50 albums list, I'm including EPs for the sake of convenience. I hope you don't have any issues with that. Additionally, as is standard practice for most negative music criticism, I'm leaving a disclaimer right here that these opinions are purely my own and may not necessarily reflect yours, so if you like any of these albums, be sure to tell me how much of a nincombutt I am for not liking them. Let some steam off in those comments. Don't let that hatred bottle up inside. It's bad for you. Starting at number 10, we have a late career album from a well-established rapper who has proven time and time again just how past his prime he is and how out of touch he's become with the modern musical landscape. It's Nasir, the latest album from Nas. This was the only album from Kanye West's run of Wyoming albums this past summer that I thought was more bad than good. Yes, the production is all there, as it always has been from Kanye. The beats are the least of my concern here. Pretty much all my issues with this album have to do with Nas himself. More often than not, he just sounds tired, as if he's just trying to reach the bare minimum standard for competency. This should be no surprise, since he hasn't really put out a full-length project worth listening to in full since It Was Written, or possibly Stillmatic, or God's Son, albums which were released anywhere from 16 to 22 years ago. So much has changed in hip-hop over the course of that time, and Nas has consistently proven himself to be unable to adapt to that change. In the case of Nasir, Nas is consistently the worst part of his own album. Kanye's production, while it is quite good throughout this album, doesn't suit Nas whatsoever, especially not at this point in his career. Not For Radio kicks things off with a decent amount of energy, and 070 Shake comes through with a pretty good hook, but some of Nas's verses here are god-awful attempts at being woke. For every halfway decent political proclamation he makes, yes, Lincoln didn't really free the slaves. Yes, the Willie Lynch speech is a hoax, and while SWAT wasn't specifically created to stop the Panthers, I see the point Nas is getting at there, since the increasing militarization of police has often affected black activist movements quite negatively, to say the least. There's a batshit conspiracy theory to go right alongside it. Neither J. Edgar Hoover or John Hanson were black, and Hanson was not a forgotten first president of America, as many like to claim. Ronald Reagan did have Alzheimer's disease, but by all accounts from his doctors, he showed no signs of the disease during his presidency, and for the love of God, Fox News was not started by a black man. The next track, Cops Shot the Kid, is just about the only song I actually like from front to back on Nasir. Nas and Kanye deliver some pretty damning verses about the state of racist police brutality in America over a sinister beat with samples of Richard Pryor and Slick Rick, affirming that this is a problem which has seen almost no solutions for decades. Unfortunately, for as good as this one track is, the buck stops there in terms of quality. Most of my time spent listening to Nasir was spent in a state of sheer boredom, with the only things breaking up the monotony being some corny-ass lyrics, of which there are at least a couple per track, including some lines which, in the wake of Kellis's allegations of physical and emotional abuse from Nas during their marriage, come off as incredibly tasteless. I'm talking specifically about these lines from Bonjour. Watch who you gettin' pregnant, that's long-term stressin'. I got a mill for every bump on your face, that's what I call a blessin'. Yeah, not even the world-famous Tony Williams can save this one. And of course there's the now infamous anti-vaxxer bars on everything, which only serve to make this incredibly drab and overly long track, it's about 7.5 plodding minutes long, even more intolerable. Nasir is yet another dud in a long line of duds that have made Nas a completely non-essential character in the modern hip-hop scene. At least we still have Illmatic. My number 9 pick is possibly the most boring 15 minutes of music I've listened to all year, Clairo's debut commercial EP, Diary 1. This is an EP that sounds nice, and that's about all the praise I can give it. Even compared to other drab lo-fi indie bandcamp bedroom pop of its kind, much of which she's plagiarized in her most popular songs, this is completely lifeless and uninteresting. Clairo has no presence as a vocalist, and her songwriting style seems to mainly be centered around lifting 2-second loops from Splice and putting some drums on them. She's literally been caught doing this, and maybe 1 or 2 other bells and whistles along the way, and calling it a track after 2 or 3 minutes. It's a sorry state of affairs that she's been granted a 12-song record deal with Fader label and the same management team Chance the Rapper uses for something as uninspired and one-note as this, while other more talented independent artists with bucket loads more personality, whose fathers aren't marketing executives who used to be the general manager of Converse, are left out to dry. Number 8 is my nominee for Worst Mainstream Trap Rap Album of the Year, Reckless, the debut solo album from Nav. Nav's popularity continues to bewilder me. He's somehow managed to get himself signed to XO, and he's collaborated with some pretty big names like Metro Boomin and Travis Scott, but he has absolutely no standout qualities as a musician. I could have put Lil Xan's Total Xanarchy or 6ix9ine's Day 69 or Dummy Boy here, but at least when I listen to those I can say, oh, that's Lil Xan or that's 6ix9ine, but what the hell does Nav have going for him? He's a rapper, singer, and producer, and he doesn't have any defining characteristics in any of those areas. Lyrically, he's got my vote for corniest ass bars of 2018, all of which are delivered in a completely monotone and unenthused vocal cadence. His production is competent, but I don't think I could pick a beat of his out of a lineup of generic insert artist here type beats you might find in a YouTube search if my life depended on it. The best beats on Reckless were made by other producers, and the best vocal performances are provided by the featured vocalists in the track list, all of whom deliver their B game and still manage to outperform Nav by leaps and bounds. Outside of the track with Travis Scott, nearly everything about Reckless just feels like a musical flatline. It's an album with pretty much no eccentricities or unique traits, and even at 12 tracks totaling just 40 minutes, it still feels like a marathon to listen to. The album I've placed at number 7 will probably make a lot of you pretty mad at me, but I can't put on a front and act like I didn't find this album dreadful to sit through. It's Blade's Red Light. Blade was the one artist I tried harder than any other this year to see the appeal of, but no matter how I slice his music, specifically this album and the one he dropped before it ever since, I simply can't. The production on Red Light is typical of the Sad Boys, Drain Gang, Swedish cloud rap sound, and it actually sounds pretty cool at first, but then you realize that every beat sounds pretty much the same. Same airy synths, same trap drums, same deep bass, rinse and repeat for 14 tracks. It also doesn't help that Blade's auto-tune singing uses about 5 different scale degrees on every track. I'm not kidding, every single track invariably uses scale degrees do, re, mi, fa, and sol in whatever major key the beat happens to be in, or the relative major if it's in a minor key. I don't think I ever heard a single la or T out of him. And even if he's going to limit himself to just these 5 notes, his lack of melodic sensibility is almost appalling. He aimlessly warbles between these 5 notes with no real sense of trying to sing something catchy or memorable, and he's sometimes singing so badly out of key that the autotune doesn't know what note to put his voice on. Whenever guest vocalist Echo 2K makes an appearance, which he does on a couple of these tracks, he immediately demonstrates a much better handle than Blade on basic musical and compositional skills such as semi-interesting melodic contour and having a voice which is pleasant to listen to. Red Light feels like an album with very little thought or care put into it. It's a vibe, sure, but with nothing of substance happening beneath the surface. Last year, my pick for worst album of the year was Black Metal Against Communism, an alt-right black metal album by a one-man band called Fate Lancer. I'll leave a link in the description to my review of that album over on Rate Your Music. The TLDR version is that it's a competent recreation of second-wave lo-fi black metal that's about 30 years out of date musically and several dozen more years out of date politically. At number 6, we have what could be considered a spiritual successor to that album. It's an album called Trigger Warning from a right-wing libertarian anti-SJW one-man metal band called Ironic Punishment Division. Musically, what we have here is a collection of extremely poor attempts at recreating the badass traditional doom metal of early Black Sabbath albums, right down to a vocal style that feels like a dollar store imitation of Ozzy Osbourne, complete with some excruciating "oh yes!" The digital drums sound terrible, and the guitar tones are absolutely disgusting. It also sounds like the dude behind this music couldn't find a way to get his tracks to stop peaking other than to put a noise gate on the master track, so you can actually hear some of the sound abruptly cutting in and out during some of the riffs that have more of a stop-start style to them. While Trigger Warning is not as outwardly hateful as Black Metal Against Communism, with most of the lyrics merely boiling down to "leftists are so mean to white people," you can still catch some frankly disgusting messages on tracks like Party Like It's 1099, which, after spending most of the track focused on a digital voice reading out accounts of murders carried out by Islamic terrorists, which I only realized was what was happening after I watched the terrible music video for this song because of how unintelligible this voice sounds, calls for a modern-day crusade, which I can only assume means a Muslim genocide. So yeah, this album sucks, and the guy who made it sucks, but this album loses out on a higher spot on this list for the simple fact that I can't help but feel like it came out far too late for it to be the sort of statement which it's trying to be. Trump had been in office for close to a year when this album came out, and songs like Trigglypuff refer to incidents that were nearly 2 years in the past at the time. I guess I just don't know who Ironic Punishment Division is trying to trigger, for lack of a better term. I know I made that video where I said the thing about not using that word that way, but it's in the title of the album, and the more I explain every little unwoke thing I do, the more I realize it's pointless. So at number 5, we have the musical embodiment of late-stage capitalism with this EP that fucking Wendy's dropped this year called We Beefin'. This EP is the musical byproduct of all those big companies and corporations, usually restaurant chains, who try and have a social media presence which is hip and relatable to the kids. Think of the Twitter accounts of Denny's, Steakum, and to a certain extent even Wendy's. They're good for a laugh here and there, and I have to give credit where credit is due to some of them for actually hiring PR people that really understand millennial shitposting on Twitter, but very quickly I'm reminded that at the end of the day this is basically identity cultivation meant to make you want to buy shit from these companies, and then it just comes off as cynical. That's really my issue with We Beefin'. It's an incredibly cynical listen. It's fun for a brief moment to listen to the Wendy's mixtape where they try to start beef with other fast food chains, but then I remember that this is basically just a commercial. I can't help but feel like this is trying to sell me something because it essentially is. All Wendy's really cares about is your dollar or my dollar, and they don't really care that we might have found their silly little mixtape funny, and for the record, I don't. That's really all there is to say about this. Number 4 is an interesting specimen. It's a bad album where the lack of quality material cannot entirely be blamed on the artist whose name is attached to it. It's the first of what may wind up being multiple posthumous albums from XXXTentacion, Skins. Skins is 10 tracks and just shy of 20 minutes long, which is in line with how XXXTentacion described what it would be upon its completion, but obviously since he was murdered this past summer, he would not be able to see whatever vision he had for this album all the way through. The result is an album which is pretty obviously underwritten, undeveloped, and hastily thrown together without all the pieces of the puzzle being there. Of course, underwritten and undeveloped were two of my favorite words to use when I would describe X's music to people even when he was alive, so in some ways not a whole lot has changed. While X was clearly a talented rapper and singer when he felt like putting the effort in, a lot of his songs were barely songs, and that continues to be the case on Skins, where many of the tracks feel like a single short blip of a musical idea, a loop that's maybe a few seconds long at most, which either repeats unchanged for a little over a minute in the case of tracks like Bad and Staring at the Sky, or it's stretched thinly over the course of 2 or 3 minutes in the case of Woe, Mind and Awe, What Are You So Afraid Of, or 1 Minute. There's not really a whole lot to talk about with Skins because there's just such a lack of material. I could talk about how Bad devotes 60 of its 90 seconds to a dull, uninteresting hook and the other 30 to an unintelligible verse. I could talk about how Staring at the Sky is the best piece of unintentional comedy I've heard on an album all year. I could even go into detail about exactly what makes Kanye West's guest verse on 1 Minute one of the most morally bankrupt and reprehensible verses of his entire career, but none of that would touch on the main issue with this album, which is that it never should have been released. So I'm just gonna leave it at that and move on to number 3, the other late career hip-hop dud on this list apart from Nasir. This is an album which seems hell-bent on blaming everyone but the artist who created it for how badly his music sucks nowadays. I am of course referring to Eminem's newest album, Kamikaze. This album was given a surprise release at the end of August and is largely a response to the negative backlash from both critics and fans which was levied toward Eminem's previous album, Revival, an album which is now almost unanimously regarded as the worst of his career. Across Kamikaze, Eminem dishes out diss after diss to anyone who's had anything even remotely negative to say about him in the past year, as well as the newest generation of trap rappers who have been dominating the charts in the past few years, and all of them come off as unhinged temper tantrums. From a 46-year-old man with a net worth of $120 million who was the best-selling artist of the 2000s in America. He seems to not understand why people hated Revival, saying that he bets people would have liked it more if there was more auto-tune or something like that. I can't tell if that's any more or less on the mark than that line on the Chloroseptic remix where he said that people hated it because he wasn't rapping like Macklemore. In both cases, I think it's fair to say he's completely missed the point. And oh, holy shit, he's still dropping the same anti-gay insults that were in poor taste even on his most critically acclaimed material. He's pushing 50 and still telling people to eat dicks. There's also the track Fall, which guest vocalist Justin Vernon disowned after realizing that Eminem calls Tyler, the Creator, a faggot in the second verse. Pretty ill timing for that one, considering Tyler essentially came out of the closet on his last album. Also, immediately after that homophobic line, Eminem doubles down with another homophobic line where he implies that Tyler worships D12's balls. He's sacrilegious, in a moment which is hilarious both in how out of touch it is and how awful that punchline is. Beyond Eminem's laughable attempts at sticking it to his critics, there are also just some glaring issues in the production and composition of Kamikaze. The inclusion of beats and flows which are lifted from modern trap trends makes it seem like Eminem is trying to parody these trends, but most of the time the production is so generic and lifeless that it totally fails on that front. There are tracks that are mixed and mastered extremely poorly, as well as some of the worst hooks of Eminem's career, which is saying a lot considering that his hooks have consistently been the worst part of his music. The featured artists he brings into the fold here are either boring as hell in the case of rappers Joyner Lucas and Royce the 5'9", or completely intolerable in the case of Jesse Reyes, the guest vocalist who makes the pair of tracks Nice Guy and Good Guy extremely difficult to sit through. In many ways, I found Kamikaze to be an even more excruciating experience than Revival was, and I think we all know by now that Revival was hot garbage. From the release of that album through the months following the release of Kamikaze, Eminem has proven himself to be possibly the most insecure artist of his stature in the entire music industry. I'm just not sure why he feels like he should ever have to care what anyone in the industry thinks of him ever for the rest of his life, considering he has more than enough to retire on. Perhaps it's time for him to consider doing just that. My number 2 and number 1 picks are the two albums I listened to this year, which I can honestly say have no redeeming qualities from an artistic standpoint. First on the chopping block is the debut album from Greta Van Fleet, Anthem of the Peaceful Army. I'm sure if you've been in the same online music circles that I have, you'll know the story with Greta Van Fleet by now. While the band is comprised of some more than competent performers on their respective instruments, and while they usually wind up creating music which is well produced and which sounds good by the standards of modern rock, there's not a single original idea to be found anywhere in their discography. That was the case on their EP material, and it continues to be the case on Anthem of the Peaceful Army. You and I both know that Greta Van Fleet are little more than Led Zeppelin impressionists. That comparison might seem tired if you've been following them up to this point, but it's literally the only way I can think to describe what they're doing. How anyone can listen to this and think of literally any other band is beyond me. Even Wolfmother, for how clearly Led Zeppelin influenced they are and how often people call them a Zeppelin ripoff band, still managed to work in some influences from other bands here and there. And even Led Zeppelin themselves, a band who were no stranger to the idea of plagiarism, managed to become household names owing to their myriad of influences in blues and folk and rock of all different stripes. Greta Van Fleet, on the other hand, with their total lack of innovation on the Zeppelin sound, seemed to operate purely as a vehicle for boomer nostalgia and wrong generation sophistry. Of course, it's got nominated for a fucking Grammy. Hey you! Yeah, you, the one writing a comment about how this band is actually bringing rock and roll back and how I'm just some limp-wristed hipster who doesn't know the first thing about real music. There are plenty of rock bands making music right now who've been influenced by all manner of different 70s hard rock, blues rock, and heavy metal. They're actually doing new and interesting things far beyond what Greta Van Fleet is putting out there. Go listen to some Uncle Acid and the Deadbeats. Listen to some Graveyard, Blood Ceremony, Clutch, Fuzz. I'm not even asking you to listen to my limp-wristed hipster music. I'll also have you know I have great wrists even for a genderless queer. Rock music as you know it never went away. You just have to put a tiny bit of effort into seeking it out nowadays. Get yourself a Rate Your Music account. It makes this shit way easier. It's the internet equivalent of crate digging, that thing you all worship as a lost art in the internet age where there are supposedly no alternatives to whatever the mainstream is throwing at us. Except, of course, there are currently more alternatives now than there have ever been, which thankfully makes listening to Greta Van Fleet totally unnecessary. Finally, at number 1, the king shit of fuck mountain of terrible albums in 2018 is an album that I honestly never would have gone out of my way to listen to if it weren't for my morbid curiosity surrounding The Crab. Yes, it's America, the newest album from 30 Seconds to Mars. I don't think there's many 2000s mainstream alt-rock bands left standing that haven't devolved into god-awful, squeaky clean, inoffensive electro-pop acts. Maroon 5, Fall Out Boy, Linkin Park, Panic at the Disco, All Time Low, and now 30 Seconds to Mars. I don't know what it is that makes these bands suddenly want to chase that Imagine Dragons One Republic money, but invariably it leads to music which winds up sacrificing anything that might have made the bands behind it at all interesting in the first place. I guess it paid off, because nearly every YouTube comment I saw in the videos for all the songs from this album seems to have been left by somebody who thinks that this shit is the second coming of Christ. For me, everything about America is unbelievably contrived, cliched, and ill-conceived. From the obscenely bombastic production to the over-the-top vocal performances, complete with a fair share of whoa-oh-oh hooks, to the vapid lyrics, this has all the markings of an album that seems like it was crafted purely to rack up Spotify streams from people who still post "Take Me Back" photos on their Instagram of the Caribbean cruise they went on 4 years ago, because that's how long it's been since they last left your hometown after graduating from high school. There's even an obligatory half-assed rap feature on One Track Mind. I really hope they cut A$AP Rocky a fat paycheck for that one. As you might be able to tell from the title of this album and the various covers created for it, I just really want to know about the crab. Oh, and I guess Face is there too. 30 Seconds to Mars is really trying to make some sort of political statement with America, but the issue with that is that there's only one politically charged song on the entire album, and that's the first fucking song, Walk on Water. As far as political songs go, this is a laughable attempt at any sort of social commentary. The most we get is some empty platitudes about how times are changing and how everyone is so divided. My favorite is this zinger: a thin line, the whole truth, the far right, the left view. Is Jared Leto trying to make some sort of equivalence between fascists and, like, the entire left wing? Because he really could have put that one a little better. Beyond the multiple covers, I continue to be perplexed and amused by the crap. And that one song, though, the political angle is never touched on again for the rest of this album. The rest of these songs are vague attempts at writing anthems about strained relationships and negative mental states, but in their attempts to relate to as many people as possible at a time, they wind up saying nothing of any real substance. Rescue Me is a song about pain, a song about empowerment, a song about faith, and a song about freedom. Freedom from the wreckage of your past, freedom from the bondage of self, and freedom to embrace all the promises that life has to offer. What the fuck are you talking about, Jared? Listen to me read some of these lyrics from the song and tell me if they fit his melodramatic description. Whatever you do, don't play my game. Too many years being the king of pain. You gotta lose it all if you want to take control. Sell yourself to save your soul. That was the entire first verse. I've never read a series of words that say so little about anything. And that's the theme throughout America. A whole lot of nothing, both lyrically and musically.
I just wanted to provide a point of clarification because I feel like my critiques might be coming off a little mean-spirited. My issue is not with 30 Seconds to Mars trying to make a song that touches on a lot of these subjects about pain, empowerment, freedom, mainly with the music video and this blurb that they put in the description. They're really trying to spread a message of positivity and removing the stigma around seeking help for mental health, and they've linked to the Treatment Advocacy Center and a bunch of other organizations that provide information on helping people through that. My issue is not with them spreading awareness about that, because honestly, I think that's just fine. My issue is with them trying to spread this message through one of the worst songs I've heard all year. So that's all. Back to the cuter cartoon version of me.
I may not be the biggest fan of this band's early work, but I can definitely see the appeal in it if you're a fan of that huge stadium alt-rock sound that was big with a lot of mainstream listeners in the 2000s. America, on the other hand, is soulless, meaningless, and utterly vacant music from a band that has long since run its course. Jared, please inform me of the ways of the crab. I must know. I must go out and spread the good word of Face. And that's the list. I eagerly look forward to being pissed off at music all over again next year. The cycle never ends. Let me know if there was any bad music this year that you were expecting me to put on this list so I can be sure to go out and not listen to it. Stay legend.